Picture this: a hall filled with gold, music, and incense. The sound of bells thunders across the marble. Crowds roar as a young woman kneels, trembling under a crown so heavy it cuts into her scalp. Everyone cheers, but she feels only the cold edge of fear. In that moment, she understands the truth: this isn't freedom. It's a sentence. That shining crown isn't a reward. It's a chain. Fairy tales told us queens lived in castles of love and luxury. History tells another story, one written in blood, silence, and sacrifice. Behind every royal wedding was a contract of power, not affection. And for many, till death do us part wasn't a vow. It was a promise fulfilled far too soon. Tonight, we step into the real world of queens, women born to rule, but caged by the very crowns they wore. Some broke, some vanished, but 7 of them learned to weaponize pain itself, to survive betrayal, torture, and loss so great it would have destroyed anyone else. These aren't fairy tales. They're autopsies of power. This is how 7 queens turned agony into empire and rewrote the meaning of survival. From the moment they opened their eyes, royal daughters weren't children. They were assets. Their destinies inked before they could even speak. Their smiles were bargaining chips, their bodies future treaties. Across Europe, kings discussed their daughters not with affection, but calculation. What could she earn in alliances? What borders could she secure? Margaret of Anjou was 6 years old when her father began negotiations with England. He called it a union. In truth, it was a sale. The little girl who played with silk dolls would one day be queen of a foreign land, traded like gold. When she finally arrived in England, the cheers of her new subjects sounded hollow. She was young, frightened, and alone, married to a man older, mentally fragile, and already broken by the weight of the crown. Henry VI of England drifted between sanity and madness. At times, he stared blankly into space while his counselors argued over who truly ruled. And when his mind failed, it was Margaret who was expected to keep the kingdom standing. She wasn't prepared to lead armies or hold court in a country that saw her as an outsider. But history never asked permission. Civil war broke out, the Wars of the Roses, and Margaret became the face of the losing side. English nobles mocked her as the foreign witch, blaming her for every failure of the crown. But instead of collapsing, Margaret hardened. The child traded away for politics, became a general. She led forces in battle, commanded troops, and fought for her son's right to inherit a kingdom that hated her. In a world built to silence women, she became louder than every man who tried to destroy her. But the cost was unbearable: her son slain, her husband imprisoned, her legacy erased by victors who feared her courage. The crown that once symbolized glory had become her executioner. Yet even in exile, Margaret's defiance survived. History tried to bury her under failure, but her name endures as the queen who refused to kneel. Royal marriage wasn't love, it was transaction. The papers were colder than iron, and every line was written in the language of control. These contracts didn't just decide alliances, they dictated a woman's worth. Catherine of Aragon's contract spelled it out in black ink. If she failed to bear a male heir, within 3 years, she could be returned to Spain, damaged and unfit. She was 15, a teenager promised to a man she'd never loved. When Prince Arthur died months after the wedding, Catherine's fate should have ended there. Instead, she was handed to his younger brother. Henry and other political move. At first, Henry VIII adored her. He called her his true wife, the mother of England. But as the years passed and no male heir survived, his affection rotted into hatred. Catherine's loyalty, her faith, her body all became targets. She endured public humiliation as Henry sought annulment, twisting religion and politics to justify his betrayal. For years she fought through letters, through courts, through prayer to keep her marriage recognized. But every argument was another step toward her own destruction. By the time Henry abandoned her for Anne Boleyn, Catherine was isolated, sick, and stripped of her title. And yet, in her quiet defiance, she won something Henry never could: dignity. Even in exile, she signed her letters Catherine the Queen. Her courage outlived the king who broke her. The church may have turned its back, but history remembered the woman who refused to let power erase her name. For queens like Catherine, survival wasn't living, it was endurance under fire. Every word they spoke, every air they bore, every breath they took was property of a man who saw them as vessels, not partners. But Catherine's silence became a weapon. Her suffering became legend. You might think a crown gave safety. In truth, it built a cage. Once the ceremony ended and the vows were spoken, the surveillance began. Queens lived surrounded by servants, but few were truly theirs. Every maid, every advisor, every lady-in-waiting carried two faces, one of service and one of obedience to the crown. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, discovered this early. Her husband, Lord Darnley, filled her chambers with spies. He read her letters, shadowed her footsteps, and questioned every whisper. When he suspected her secretary, David Rizzio, of being too close, he murdered him in front of her. The blood stained her gown before it dried on the floor. For Mary, every wall echoed with suspicion. She couldn't rule, couldn't trust, couldn't even breathe without his permission. Her palace became a theater of control, her crown a collar she couldn't remove. But Mary wasn't the only one suffocating under watch. Catherine de' Medici faced her own nightmare inside the French court. Her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, weaponized the Queen's ladies-in-waiting to humiliate her. They reported her moods, her letters, her body. Every private moment turned into gossip for the court. Imagine living in a world where even your nightmares were reported. That was royal life. Queens were expected to smile while being dissected alive by the system they embodied. Catherine endured this psychological warfare for decades, until the day came when she learned to reverse the game. By the time she became regent of France, the same machinery used to watch her now served her. The spies who once reported on her now whispered for her. It was the first hint of something history would see again and again: pain turning into strategy, humiliation transforming into control. Behind palace walls, violence wore the mask of duty. Kings didn't just rule their wives, they disciplined them. Marital correction, they called it, a polite term for cruelty. Henry VIII didn't merely destroy his wives through politics. He destroyed them with his hands. And Boleyn's long sleeves weren't fashion, they hid the bruises of control. Catherine Howard's trembling steps toward execution were the last of a girl beaten into obedience. And when Henry replaced one queen with another, the court applauded. They called it keeping order. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible made brutality into ritual. His first wife, Anastasia, was said to have died of illness. In truth, her body was covered in fractures. His second wife died of strangulation, another accident. Ivan's rages were legend, but his victims had no voice. A queen who protested could be executed for treason. For defying divine authority, obedience wasn't devotion, it was survival. Every night, these women slept knowing that a wrong word could become a death sentence. They were the ornaments of empires, trapped between reverence and ruin. And yet, from within that silence, something ancient stirred resilience. The queens who couldn't fight with armies fought with patience. Their survival was quiet, invisible, but unbreakable. It's what made their stories endure long after their crowns turned to dust. In royal courts, pregnancy wasn't celebrated, it was feared. For a queen, childbirth was a ritual of survival, a moment where her life was balanced between two blades, death and dynasty. Every pregnancy was a political event. The king's legacy rested inside her body. And if the child was male, she became a saint. If it was female or dead, she became a curse. There was no middle ground. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, entered labor under the gaze of physicians and courtiers, not as a woman, but as an instrument of succession. Henry's orders were simple and brutal: save the child, not the mother. So when complications arose, they cut her open while she was still conscious. No anesthesia, no mercy. She screamed through the pain as the baby was pulled from her body. Edward VI, England's future king, cried once, and the court erupted in joy. 12 days later, Jane was dead. The palace mourned her publicly, but in private, Henry celebrated. His heir had been secured. The woman who gave him what he wanted had served her purpose. Across Europe, the same tragedy unfolded in silence. Mary de' Medici, Queen of France, endured 6 pregnancies. Each one carved pieces out of her body and her soul. By the 5th, she could barely walk. By the 6th, she was paralyzed. Yet the kingdom rejoiced. Another prince. Royal medicine was closer to superstition than science. Doctors mixed herbs with mercury, cut open flesh to balance humors, and prayed over dying mothers like priests performing last rites. The instruments they used: iron hooks, forceps. Knives were tools of mutilation disguised as salvation. For queens, pain wasn't just endured, it was expected. Their suffering was proof of loyalty, their deaths proof of duty. And yet, within that torment, something defiant remained. These women understood their agony would feed the machine of empire, but they also knew it would outlast it. Because while their bodies broke, their stories didn't. Every scar, every scream, every drop of blood spilled in childbirth whispered the same truth through time. Power built on women's suffering never stands forever. When a king tired of his queen, he didn't simply send her away. He staged her destruction. The execution of a queen wasn't an act of justice, it was theater. a performance for the world to see what happens when power disobeys its master. And Boleyn's trial was a masterpiece of lies. She was accused of witchcraft, incest, and adultery. The court called her a monster, a seductress, a traitor. But her true crime was simple: she had failed to give Henry a son. The morning of her death, and dressed in grey, the colour of mourning, she stood tall, her voice steady as she praised the king who was about to kill her, not because she believed her words, but because she knew defiance would make her death harder for her daughter, Elizabeth. The sword fell in one clean motion, and the crowd cheered as if watching a play's final act. But the performance didn't end there. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, was 19 when she faced the block. She'd been abused since childhood, used as proof of scandal, accused of treason for her own trauma. On the morning of her execution, she collapsed from fear. Guards carried her to the scaffold, and even then, she was forced to speak lines prepared for her. "I pray for the king's soul." Further north, Mary, Queen of Scots, met a slower, crueler end. 18 years she spent in captivity under her cousin Elizabeth's watch. No family, no letters, no freedom, just isolation designed to break her mind. When they finally brought her to die, she had to be lifted to the platform. The executioner struck once, missed. The second blow still didn't sever her neck. Only on the third swing did it end. The silence that followed was heavy, almost holy. Even the witnesses couldn't celebrate. They had seen not a queen's punishment, but humanity's disgrace. These weren't accidents. They were messages carved into history. No woman, no matter how crowned, could challenge a man's authority and live. But the irony is that death didn't erase these women. It immortalized them. The kings who killed them are footnotes. The queens they murdered are legends. Some queens learned that the only way to survive a world built to destroy them was to become what it feared most. Catherine de' Medici began her reign as a Ponitalian. Foreign, ridiculed. The court called her barren, mocked her accent, and worshipped her husband's mistress. But when the king died and her sons were too young to rule, Catherine became something else. She used the tools once used against her: spies, poisons, rumors, and manipulation. The same corridors that had whispered about her now whispered for her. They called her the Black Queen, the spider at the center of the web. But Catherine wasn't cruel for pleasure, she was cruel for survival. "I have done things that will damn my name forever," she once wrote. "But I did them so that my children would live." Elizabeth I of England chose another kind of power. She watched what marriage did to her mother, Anne Boleyn, and swore never to wear those chains. She ruled alone, her crown her only companion. Courtiers begged her to marry, but she refused. "I am married to England," she said. Behind her words was pain, the knowledge that love would make her vulnerable, and vulnerability would get her killed. Her reign was filled with brilliance and loneliness. She ordered the death of her cousin, Mary Stuart, not out of hatred, but necessity. Elizabeth knew that as long as Mary lived, men would use her name to challenge her rule. When she signed the death warrant, she sealed her own isolation. Later, she wrote, "I have signed away the life of my own blood, and with it, my soul, and then There was Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca. Joanna the Mad, but madness was her disguise. When her husband, Philip the Handsome, died, she refused to bury him. Historians said she was insane. In truth, she was strategic. So long as Philip's body remained unburied, she remained queen. If she let go, the men around her would strip her of power and marry her off again. Her father imprisoned her for 46 years. Her son later continued her captivity. They said she was too unstable to rule. Yet, every record of her captivity shows letters written with perfect clarity. She was never mad, only too clever for the world that wanted to silence her dot in their pain. These queens found something divine: patience, calculation, and the will to live in defiance of fate itself. Survival was no longer about breathing. It was about control. History paints queens in gold and diamonds, but the truth is iron and blood. The crown was never a symbol of privilege. It was a shackle forged by politics, by men, by the endless hunger for heirs and power. These 7 women lived within that machinery and found ways to turn its blades. Margaret of Anjou, who led armies when no one else dared. Catherine of Aragon, who faced humiliation with unwavering faith. Mary Stuart, who turned captivity into legend. Catherine de' Medici, who transformed fear into influence. Elizabeth I, who ruled alone in a man's world. Joanna of Castile, who used madness to protect her throne. Jane Seymour, whose sacrifice birthed a dynasty. Their lives were warnings, their deaths memorials. And yet, through centuries of silence, they whisper the same message, that even in the darkest cages, the human spirit can find power. When you see a crown behind glass, don't imagine luxury. Imagine the weight. Imagine the hands that bled to hold it. Imagine the eyes that stared into its reflection and saw not glory, but destiny. These women didn't live fairy tales. They lived wars disguised as marriages. Their victories were invisible, but they endured, and in enduring, they conquered. So tonight, as we close this story, remember them not as victims, but as architects of their own survival. The queens who turned pain into power and made the world remember that even in silence, strength can roar. Before you go, hit that like button and subscribe. Because history doesn't just belong to kings. It belongs to those who refused to die quietly.